You're listening to the Gulf Stream, where we talk to fascinating guests that want to make the Gulf of Mexico, and moreover, the world, a more sustainable and more beautiful place. Don't worry about getting bogged down in scientific jargon or academic lecturing. On the Gulf Stream, we break down complex ideas into simple, yet intriguing subjects that will help you be more informed and perhaps inspire you to create a better environment for all of us. After all, it takes people like you to make a difference in some of the toughest issues facing the Earth today. Welcome to the Gulf Stream.
This is Megan Radke, Communications Coordinator at the Heart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies at Texas A&M University-Corpus Christi. While normally I work behind the scenes as a producer on the Gulf Stream, for this episode, I sat down behind the microphone for a conversation with Dr. Keisha Bahr. Keisha is an assistant professor of marine biology at Texas A&M University-Corpus Christi, an HRI fellow, a coral reef ecologist, and an all-around fascinating person. In this episode, Keisha and I talk about her work and why everyone should care about coral reefs. We celebrate National Women in Science Day. We talk about a new book she co-authored, and we even discuss diving and some of her most memorable experiences while working in the field. I hope you enjoy the episode. Dr. Keisha Bahr, thank you so much and for coming today, and welcome to the Gulf Stream podcast. So I'll introduce myself. I'll get started because our viewers and our listeners probably don't know me. Normally I'm sitting behind the scenes in one of those chairs over there, but my name is Megan Radke. I'm the Communications Coordinator here at HRI, Heart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies, say the full name there. So yeah, like I said, normally I'm behind the scenes. I've got a background in communications. I've got a bachelor's in journalism. I've got a master's in agriculture. So I'm not a scientist. I am not a marine scientist, but I can communicate the science. So there very well may be a point today when I'm like, hey, Keisha, you've got to explain this to me like I'm 5, right? So, but I would love it if you can just introduce yourself and tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, so I'm Keisha Bahr. I have a PhD in actually zoology.
Oh, very cool.
Right? I know.
Yeah.
But everything I study is underwater. In particular, I study coral reefs, and more recently studying how other things are growing, such as oysters. I'm from a very small town in Ohio and made my way to Florida, then Hawaii, and now in Texas.
Awesome.
So I'm really excited to be here. Also, I think what's really fun is I am the first person in my family to leave my small town.
Aww.
And also the first person to go to college, too.
Okay. See, now this is cool. We already have something in common because
You were also the first?
Also the first.
Yeah.
I'm from a very small town in Texas near Waco, so no one's ever heard of it, but definitely the first from my family to, venture out, get a master's, and, to say that I'm working in science communications at this point, they're kind of like, where did this come from?
Were they like, does science need communicated?
Yeah, exactly, right. But yeah, so that's really cool. So I know that you just said you work with coral, and you've got your lab just right across the road on campus here. So tell us a little bit about what you guys do in the Bahr lab.
Yeah, well, so when I was doing a lot of my research training, I was under the impression that research was only for research. So when I established my own lab, I kind of wanted to have research with a purpose and having multiple purposes. So we mostly focused on coral reefs, but other foundational species such as oysters. And the goal of our lab is to really produce information and science that is going to help guide management or conservation or restoration practices. So, of course, we do a lot of the hard science that you typically think of, but we also do a lot of the applied science and communications of the science that we do as well.
Okay, very cool. So,
yeah, because it's not just all science. We need to actually implement the science that we're doing.
Yeah, most definitely. And we need to, make sure that science is clear to those audiences that we're trying to communicate to, and so they can find a way to relate to it. But we'll get back to that later.
Yeah.
I want to dive into that further, but you were showing us around your lab yesterday, and I heard you say, so many interesting things, but one thing that I really caught on to is you called coral an animal. And so I don't think a lot of people think of coral that way. Like most people probably see, really colorful corals and think like, oh, it's a plant, or they might think it's some type of rock or something like that. So coral's an animal. Like,
Yeah, I like to actually call them snotty rocks.
Snotty rocks.
Snotty rocks,
Okay.
yeah. Because
okay.
if you pick them up out of the water, which please, I don't recommend people do, but
Yeah.
they do have a mucus and it looks like a snotty rock.
Okay.
But yes, they are animals. And the really cool thing, they're like very complex, complicated animals because they are itself an animal, but inside of the tissues, they have algae that live inside of them and help them grow. And at the same time, they do produce a calcium carbonate skeleton, so they are a rock as well. So they're really complicated, but they're also really fascinating because they build these structures that we can even see from space. But the actual animal is very, very tiny. It's only 1 millimeter too thick that is actually living on a coral skeleton.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's insane because they are animals. People think that they're just colorful rocks or snotty rocks, like I mentioned, but they're actually extremely important for our ecosystems. And a lot of the things that we have or we like to do or eat is because of coral reefs.
So that leads me right into my next question. So, coral reefs, people may not be able to see them, and that goes with a lot of things in the ocean, right? It's a lot of things that we can't see that we don't know that's there. So people may be asking like, well, why should we care about it? Or, what does it do? What does it do good for the earth? And what does it do good for our ecosystems? So maybe you could elaborate a little bit about why coral is important.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's really hard to communicate with some people when they live far from the ocean too, is because they don't see that direct connection of how things in the ocean benefit people on land. And when we think about where our food comes from, there's not really always a connection of, hey, that did come from the ocean, and at some point that animal did live on a coral reef. So that is what we think about, and the importance that we talk about with corals is that at one point, corals are supporting some animals that we do take or some resources that we do take from our oceans.
Okay.
And in more of our coastal areas, they do provide a natural barrier. So when we think of mangroves and how they might help reduce the amount of wave action or oyster reefs as well, corals do the same in island communities or in Florida, a little bit closer to the mainland here. Also, a lot of the different medicines that we have come from coral reefs.
Really?
Yeah, it's very interesting because we have all of these resources that come from corals. They support nearly 1/4 of all of our marine life and a lot of things that we do rely on and every day. And of course, we get some of our medicines as well. And some people just don't understand where these things come from because we do just go to the store and pick them up.
Sure.
But they are very important. And also they're important for tourism. If you think about it, we like to, at least I like to go somewhere that's warm and has really clear waters. And alongside that, we do have coral reefs that are associated in those warm, clear water areas, which make really good diving, really good snorkeling, and also other water activities such as surfing.
Yeah.
Hard to go surfing if you don't have a reef to help break up that water and
To
create
make a
that
wave. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. I mean, that's, it's a lot easier. And this is something that I worked with and dealt with a lot. I previously worked as a press officer for Texas Parks and Wildlife, and I worked with the wildlife division. And, a lot of our messaging kind of centered around conservation and hunting activities, as well as fishing. And so fishing is something we talk about a lot here at HRI. And it becomes really interesting when you are able to make that connection between like you said with medicines and coral, between your food and fish and oysters and all of these things and how they interact and why that, they're so important to us and our ways of life. And so it's not something that we should by any means take for granted. So
Right. And it is a little bit harder if we are so far away from corals. But, something I'm assuming we'll talk about is that we do have corals that are relatively close to us, and we do rely on those sources. And just making that connection and having some more information or knowledge about that, or even being able to see it, will make the world of a difference. Because the first time I saw a coral reef underwater, I was like, what the heck? I actually thought people were hiding this from me. I was like, what?
Wow.
How do I not know about this? Because it wasn't part of my education growing up. Like there's these underwater cities that exist that are beautiful and very noisy. And how do we not know? Like, how did I not know about it?
Very noisy. Okay. What kind of noises are going on?
Oh, so many. Well, so it depends on where you are. But a lot of the noises that we hear on reefs are typically from the reefs, the fish either eating some of the coral or eating some algae on top of the substrate or the bottom of the coral reef. Also, we hear a lot of snapping shrimp making noises. The fish are really noisy. And it's really important that these reefs are noisy because it's indicating a really healthy system.
Sure. Yeah.
But then also, depending on where you are, you might hear other things such as like dolphins or whales as well, which is really beautiful to hear underwater. So it's extremely noisy underwater. And that was part of it. It's like a bustling underwater city that I just felt like why am I not learning about this?
Mhm.
Like, I need to know more about this,
We should
and
explore this.
we
yeah.
need to explore it and tell more people about it too.
Well, so a little bit of a segue here. You mentioned also when we were in the lab yesterday, and it's just kind of digging down deeper into the world of coral. You mentioned that you guys examine the DNA of coral, and so that kind of blew my mind as well, because it's not, coral is a lot different than like certain other organisms and species where you can just draw blood, or like you can take an otolith from a fish and age it that way, but coral, you can extract DNA from coral. That's amazing.
Yeah, because corals are animals, so they have DNA. And the really hard thing about working with corals, well, there's a lot of hard things, but when we talk about the DNA of coral, we also have to talk about the DNA of the algae. And alongside the algae, the coral has this microbiome, we call it, of these bacteria and fungi and viruses that are associated with it too. So you kind of have to know a little bit more about that whole organism. We like to call it a holobiont, because it's not just the coral, it's the coral, the algae, the bacteria, it's everything together. So it's essentially its own little community, and you need to be able to understand what that community looks like and that composition of all those things together. So we tried to separate the coral by itself, the algae by itself, and then get some measurements of the microbiome too, or the bacterial communities.
How do you do that? I mean, can you like describe that, or is it a process that we would just have to see?
Well, some of it we can like physically separate the coral from its algae, which sounds really, I don't know, it kind of sounds a little evil, like separating it. But also there's different DNA techniques that we can take in terms of targeting certain sequences in the DNA structure that will tell us a little bit more about the algae versus about the coral versus the bacterial communities. And that's just based on the traits that are only characteristic and relative to that organism that we're looking at. So that's, cool. Getting into the technical side of things, but sometimes so simple, we remove the tissue from the coral and we just spin it down and we can separate the zooxanthellae or the algae in the coral from each other. Wow. And it sounds very, like I said, evil, like
like taking something from this critter, right?
Right.
Yeah. No, but that's fascinating, and I couldn't stop thinking about that after you mentioned it yesterday.
Coral DNA.
Coral DNA. It's so cool. I mean, I'm sure your students just kind of they're in heaven when they're in there and having a great time.
Yeah. Well, the reason why we do the DNA of corals is because the corals are really complicated in terms of how they grow their structures, and some of them grow and look exactly the same, but they're different species. And so it becomes really hard to know, if we look at this coral and it looks like this, but it also looks like this one, are they the same species or not? And we can look at the DNA to determine if they are different species or not.
Okay.
And that helps us understand what that species diversity is, like how many corals do we have in the Caribbean or the Gulf versus how many are in the Pacific, and also what potentially we might see happening as our waters are changing. Are some species better at dealing with changes in the water compared to other species?
Okay, I want to come back to that thought, but you mentioned at the beginning that you lived in Hawaii and you've got quite an extensive background in Hawaii, and I know that you guys still do some trips to Hawaii and in the Pacific. So my only exposure to Hawaii at this point in my life, unfortunately, I'll get there one day, but my only exposure, is shows like Meat Eater and like watching things about kayak fishing and spearfishing. Kimmy Warner is very much a hero of mine. So everybody out there, if you don't know Kimmy Warner, please Google Kimmy Warner. But so that's my only exposure to Hawaii, and it looks like such a paradise. So I would just like to know, like, I love Texas. I'm from Texas, but how did you make that transition from Hawaii to here?
Yeah, I think that's like the really interesting thing about the time I spent in Hawaii, because I think the biggest thing I gained from that, living there for nearly a decade, actually over a decade, was learning how to live with the land instead of on the land, and really be more of a community oriented. Since you're limited in the amount of space that you have, everyone kind of works together in order to make the best use of that space that you have. So when I left Hawaii and came here, I was like, first of all, I had no idea Texas was this big. That was my first thing. I'm like, how is Texas, how does it take like 14 hours sometimes just to get out of Texas? That was my, and in Hawaii, we would only drive, the maximum you could drive was like 45 minutes.
Wow.
So that was my biggest adjustment for that.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah.
But making that transition and coming back to the mainland, as we call it in Hawaii, was really actually rewarding for me, because I felt so privileged to be able to live so close to coral reefs and learn about them and study them. And when I came here to this university, I began to realize not everyone has been so fortunate as I was. And I was really excited to bring corals a little bit closer to people here.
Aw.
And be able to show them that, hey, this may seem like it's really far away, but it is really important that we all understand how we still can impact corals, even though that we feel like we're far away from them.
Sure. I mean, have you, from your work there and,
Mhm.
and now working here and getting to explore areas like the flower garden banks, like how do corals, do Texas corals and corals in the Gulf, do they face kind of the same issues that you were seeing in the Pacific?
You know, it's really interesting. I have been really fortunate to go to some of the most remote places where only a handful of people have been able to go dive on these reefs. And one of the things that we have continuously seen is regardless of where you are, you can be thousands of miles away from people or the nearest city, and you can still see impacts of humans in those areas. A lot of the problems that we were seeing were plastic pollution.
Okay. Yeah.
So even though we've been to the most remote places, we are still seeing impacts. And when I came to Texas and learned more about the flower gardens, my first question is, okay, well, what kind of impacts have we seen there? And one of the things that I learned was that, one, the flower garden banks are amazing, and the sanctuary that's been developed around it has been very, very effective and really, really important for preserving this really unique ecosystem. But then second, a lot of us thought that it was so far away and so removed from the mainland here that it was protected, and it was also very deep, so it was unlikely to be influenced by humans or runoff from land or warming that could potentially happen.
Mhm.
And now we're learning more and more as our oceans are changing that all of our ecosystems are experiencing some impact, and the flower gardens is one of those. And now we're really concerned about how do we continuously preserve these ecosystems, even though they are remote, but they are still being impacted. And a lot of people just still don't know that those reefs are there, and we really need to do what we can to help preserve them so more and more people and future generations can see them.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, people will work hard to take care of something that they understand, that
Right.
they've seen, and
Mhm.
you know that they know something about. So it's definitely worth it to keep spreading the word about these really special places. And you had mentioned, I think yesterday, that some of the corals that you saw in the flower gardens were like, what'd you say, the size of a minivan, something like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, and that's the funny thing. When I went, I was like, okay, yeah, like I've been to some places where the coral cover is 100%, you know, where you only see corals, and it's amazing, and corals the size of this table here. And when I got the opportunity to go to the flower gardens, I heard amazing stories about them, and I don't think that I could have prepared myself for what I was going to see because it's one of those things where people are like, yeah, the coral was this big, you know, like with fish.
Sure, yeah.
And when I dove down, one, it's really deep. Like the shallowest we were was about 70 feet.
Wow.
And it's very, very deep. But then two, some of the corals that I saw were some very slow growing corals that would take tens and hundreds of years in order to get to that size.
That's incredible.
And just being like, those corals are larger than I am was just like astonishing. And at that moment, you realize how small you are
Mhm.
and
Oh,
like how
gosh,
precious
sure.
an ecosystem like that is. And just seeing these brain corals that are just the size of minivans was just like, I had no idea that those corals could get that big.
That's something that I really, really like about just going outside in general, be it, you know, I've never been diving, but I'm sure it's the same experience. But when you go up into the mountains or just go to a really expansive place, it makes you realize how small you are.
Right.
And it makes you realize what an incredible place like our planet is, and just how fortunate we are to be able to see these things. So that's really cool that you had that experience. But I know that when you recently one of your recent trips out there, you had gone actually joined by Terry Palmer. He's one of our researchers here in our Coastal Conservation and Restoration Lab. You guys went on a disease detection kind of a response trip, as well as you helped out with some long-term monitoring tasks at the flower gardens. So tell us a little bit about that trip.
Yeah. You know, that trip, the first time we went out, it was about 2 weeks before the response trip. And it was part of this group effort across different agencies to go out there and try to conduct and continue the long-term monitoring that's been happening there. And it happens across our ocean. And when we went back, and honestly, I was in denial. I really thought that a disease outbreak wasn't going to happen there, kind of like everyone else was thinking, like,
Because it's so remote.
It's so remote. It's really unlikely. Like, how could it get there? We had a feeling that it might be coming, But it was one of those things where we went and I dove and I wouldn't believe it until I saw it for my own eyes. And part of the trip out there was, one, doing some surveys and assessing and quantifying, but then also applying some antibacterial paste as well on the corals. And part of it was, I kind of have mixed feelings about it because we wanted to understand what was going on and then try to help reduce the amount of disease spreads that was happening at the same time. But at the same time, you have this feeling of, you know how precious this ecosystem is, you know how long it takes for these corals to grow, and you know what is at stake here.
Right.
And when you see that progression of disease that's happening and you know that it's only going to get worse, it's really hard to remain optimistic about the outcome of that. So I think at the time when we were there, I'm really happy I went the first time without seeing disease because I gained that appreciation. And then when I went the second time, it was more of that urgency that, hey, we
have to protect this
we need to
place.
do something
because
we previously thought that these reefs were going to be protected forever because they're so remote. And now we know that that's not the case anymore.
Wow. That's really amazing. You know, I hope that just, you know, people listening to this and, you know, the more people that are able to learn about what you guys are doing in your lab, you know, will really take that to heart and recognize that even these remote places, you know, they need our respect and they need our protection and stuff. So, but it's also fascinating to think that, you know, you can go to a coral reef and start to hopefully repair it in some way with you know, antibiotics. That's pretty interesting.
Right. Yeah. And it's something that, you know, there are some controversies around that. Like, should we do something should we not, or should we do something or not about it? And part of the idea of it is that these animals take so long to grow and we only have so many of them and they're already threatened in a lot of other places. And some of the corals that we have at the flower gardens are, you know, nearing extinction other places. And it comes to a point where it's like, we need to do what we can do right now in order to make sure that these do survive and make it. And when we are there, you kind of do feel at the same time, like, of course you have this feeling of, wow, this is really terrible. But then look, I'm actually physically helping and putting antibiotics on this coral. And I'm hoping that this will help that coral survive. So you are essentially like a coral doctor when you're out there, which is really exciting at the same time. Dr. Coral. trying to help. Like, yes, I'm going to put this on there and hopefully that we'll see them again. And since it's so remote to get to the flower garden banks, we have been trying to get back out there to see how our actions have made a difference and what the status of the disease is right now too.
Oh, that's so cool.
So hopefully we'll be able to go out relatively soon and see how it looks to that.
For sure. This is probably a loaded question. If you don't have an answer off the top of your head, that's okay. But, you know, if you could tell, you know, just our viewers and listeners, if there's something that just the everyday person could do that could perhaps lessen their impact on just our oceans and lessen our impact on coral reefs, like what would you suggest people do?
You know, that's a really good question because I think when we think about these problems, it seems really overwhelming.
It's like too much,
It's too much. And then it's hard to comprehend, like, if this problem is so large, how could I do something in my individual life to make a difference? Or like the things that I do, does it really matter?
Sure.
And that's a question I get a lot from my students or any talks that I give to the public because it could be very depressing talking about coral decline. And we try to take a more optimistic approach that we help invoke change and not just discourage people from doing anything.
For sure.
So just, you know, to answer your question is the number one thing that I always say is carbon.
Okay.
What we know is that everything is impacted by the amount of carbon that we use. And the more carbon that we put into the atmosphere, the more changes that we're seeing in our oceans. So if we could do small things in our life to reduce the amount of carbon that we're producing, such as eating lower on the food chain or eating less red meat, or potentially driving, instead of driving so much to work, or maybe we can walk or bike other places instead, or switch to more renewable resources, that is not only helping corals, it's helping all of our ecosystems. So that's what I like to talk about. Because of course we can talk about other things that are occurring more locally, but that is an issue that we can address by just individually reducing how much carbon that we're emitting into the atmosphere.
And it just takes, you know, like you said, it can be very overwhelming to a lot of people, you know, just thinking about the big picture, but it really just takes small actions from all of us, like little bitty things, little bitty changes, and, you know, it can make a really big difference.
Right.
it's a really good excuse for me to ride my bike to work. So, which
exactly.
is fun.
You're helping the planet and you're helping yourself.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good exercise.
Yeah, it's a cardio burn.
Yeah.
And that's something that it's a small substitute that you can make. And one of the things that we try to encourage with some of the students in our classes, like, hey, let's all try Meatless Monday, and then we'll share like some ways that we can eat more vegetarian focused meals, or they'll do more carpooling. Like, hey, can we carpool together and try to reduce the amount of carbon that we're emitting? Because that's one of the major drivers that we're seeing the changes that are occurring. And like I said, not just corals, it's everything, more wildfires that we're seeing as well. And it is really easy just to makes very conscious decisions that do reduce the amount of carbon that you are emitting.
So I want to dive in, no pun intended there, but a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more about diving at the flower gardens. You mentioned that it's a really difficult dive, and that some of like the minimum depth that you guys went was 70 feet, which sounds, that's pretty intense, right? But so I don't know a lot about diving. I don't know a lot about scuba, but I am very interested in Terry, who I mentioned earlier. I was just having a casual conversation with him about free diving, which, if I'm into spearfishing, then I'm kind of interested in free diving, right? He recommended a book to me called Deep by James Nestor. And it's kind of like what Born to Run was to running. It's what deep is to free diving.
Okay.
So make that comparison that way. But so when you're free diving, for anybody who doesn't know, you're going underwater, single breath of air, and you're holding it for however long you're underwater, and you're moving, and so therefore your muscles are using up oxygen that way. But when you start to feel uncomfortable, it's because your body is building up carbon dioxide, right? So and then there's the whole pressure issue at deeper depths. So yeah, that sounds pretty dangerous and pretty intense. Having no oxygen and having no like tools, like nitrox, I believe was something that you guys used. So like, tell me a little bit about why that's such a difficult dive, and why diving to those depths, even when you have oxygen and, whatever else it is that you might take down there with you, why is it so difficult?
Well, first I will say, freediving is way more difficult than scuba diving. And you just saying all that stuff, I'm like, wow, that makes me so anxious, because my freediving depth is like 5 feet, and I'm like, I need air.
Well, apparently there's like stretches you can do, and it's all my knowledge of it is from that book. So it's fascinating. I would really recommend it. But
and freediving should be an Olympic sport if it isn't already.
For sure.
With scuba diving, the reason why diving at the flower garden banks is challenging is because of the depth that you are going to. Normally, scuba diving is a very safe recreational activity that anyone can partake in, and it's relatively safe, or it is most of the time safe, as long as you're trained well and it's adequate training that you have, and it's safe conditions. The issue at the flower garden banks is that you have to go so deep to get to the reef that when you're at that depth, you can only stay at bottom or down for a certain amount of time.
Wow.
And once you have limited air supply, you need to come to the surface. So it takes a lot longer to come up to the surface than you would in a normal, shallower dive.
Because you can't just swim quickly to the surface.
You cannot. Right? Yeah, you need to ascend or come to the surface very, very slow, or you could have some issues with some bubbling of your in your blood and
really scary things.
Yeah, really scary things. So you need to come up relatively slow when you are diving that deep. So that's the biggest issue. And then in any other types of situations where you're diving, you have to be really careful about what your surroundings are. And sometimes at the flower gardens, there are pretty heavy currents.
Okay.
And if you're dealing with a current, you're using a lot more air, more oxygen consumption, less time at the bottom, and then more of that concern, like I need to get to the top before I run out of air.
Sure.
So those are the really the big things. Anything else is just like us breathing air right now, except for we can't breathe out of our nose underwater. We breathe out of our mouth, which is something I always forget when I'm underwater. I'm like, oh wait, I have to breathe in and out of my mouth like a mouth breather the whole time.
Right.
But when you're underwater, the way that I like to think about it is like you're an astronaut.
Yeah.
Like you are really an aquanaut. And it's such a fascinating thing that it's like you're in this underwater alien world and you're like reliant on your air supply in some aspects, and you get to explore and you're completely weightless.
That's
which
amazing.
It's amazing.
You really are an astronaut in that sense.
Right, exactly.
An aquanaut, yeah.
And the thing is, I don't think a lot of us have that experience of completely being weightless.
Sure.
And that's such a really amazing feeling. And you're just submersed, literally your pun right there.
Yeah.
You're submersed in another world. And that's really rewarding. And all those things together make diving or scuba diving really worth it. And you don't have to have that concern of how long have I been holding my breath before I need to go to the surface.
Yeah.
So it is a relatively safe practice of scuba diving. It's just the depths that we're concerned at with how long we can stay down.
Didn't mean to at all like turn anyone off of any kind of diving activity. If you want to try it, please do so safely. But yeah, I think that that's something that kind of draws me to the idea of free diving and scuba is the idea that like you have to remain calm and you have to, be mindful about everything that's going on around you and you have to remain present in that situation. And I think that's something that, we could practice a little bit more of just in our daily lives.
Right.
So.
Yeah. And that's something I think that's the biggest thing with diving is that realizing there are all of these things that could go wrong, but they will likely not go wrong if you remain calm and you have that training that you need. And luckily for us, in terms of our line of work, we undergo extensive scuba diving training in order to be able to go on these excursions and work with these people because we have a lot of tasks that we have to do and we need to make sure that we are very safe when we are doing those.
Most definitely. And I think that I feel like you had maybe told me when we were working on a press release, like just, a few months ago, Texas A&M University-Corpus Christi offers quite a bit of dive training for students. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. What kind of diving can students get into? What can they learn?
Yeah. It's actually a really great program that we've been constructing over the past few years. And we've developed a partnership with Texas State Aquarium too, to help with some of the training that we do.
Our friends.
Yeah. It's really great because we get to go, part of the training is you get to go dive at the aquarium.
Okay.
And which is a really unique experience. I haven't done it yet, which I feel kind of weird saying I haven't dove at the aquarium yet.
Soon. It will happen.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about that is you are surrounded by sharks. Like you dive in the exhibits that have sharks in it.
It's a very real experience.
Yeah. And the sharks are like, oh, hey, there you are. And then just go on living their life. Yeah. But part of the training that we do here, we do offer scientific diver training. And it sounds like super fancy, and I guess it is kind of fancy, but part of it is within that training, you get your advanced diver, you can get your nitrox diver, you can get your rescue, and your master diver. So you're really getting 4 certifications in one.
That's so cool.
And you could do it in about a year usually. In my training that I did it in Hawaii, and we got it in, I think, 3 weeks. It was really intense.
Yeah, really fast.
Yeah, really, really fast, but really intensive diving. And it's just multiple hours underwater. I don't know how much time I've spent underwater. I stopped counting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really amazing. And we'll come back to that thought later too, because I would like to hear about some of your most memorable experiences while diving, because I think you probably got some pretty good stories there. But so you mentioned Texas State Aquarium, our friends across the bay there. So tell me about some of the work that you've done with them aside from just the diving.
Yeah. So I love working with Texas State Aquarium. And one of the first things I did when I started my position here at A&M Corpus was reach out to them and say, hey, I heard you guys have corals. How are you keeping corals in captivity? I want to learn more. But then also reaching out and establishing that connection of how can we work together to help promote the education in the public of, hey, we have really amazing alien creatures that build these really amazing structures and we should tell everyone about them because they're not just rocks.
Right.
So part of the work that we started doing, I've been working with them for almost 4 years now, was trying to understand more about the health of corals and develop an index or a color chart of how healthy corals are. And this kind of started with the work I did in Hawaii, where we have had these events that have happened where corals are not so healthy, and we call them bleaching events. And part of it was we needed a need to understand if a coral is healthy or not. And we wanted to empower and develop a tool for the community to go out and say, hey, that coral is healthy or that coral is not healthy.
Just by looking at it.
Just by looking at it. And all this happened with my PhD advisor, who had a really great sense of humor. And he asked me, how do I tell if a coral is healthy or not? And I'm very young, very eager graduate student, and I'm trying to impress him, right? And say all these crazy things. These, you do this and you do this, all these complicated things. Yeah. And he just smirked at me, and I love this because it's just ingrained in my memory. He just smirked and he just said, "Oh, you just look at it."
And you're
was
like,
yeah,
of course you do.
Exactly. And that was kind of like the whole idea behind a color indicator was if you look at a coral, you know how healthy it is because of the color of the coral.
Wow.
So if a coral is not healthy, the color will get lighter, and that's indicating that it doesn't have as much algae inside of its tissue. So the lighter it is, it's less healthy than it could be. And we wanted to really develop a way that other people could say, yes, this coral is healthy or not. So we did that for corals in Hawaii, and it's been really, really helpful for the community to go out and monitor corals and report that online so we can see where there might be unhealthy corals are, where they might be, and maybe bleaching might be happening, and where we can implement some restoration or management actions.
Very cool.
So when I came here, I told the folks at Texas State Aquarium about it, and they're like, oh, that's awesome, because we have this wellness program, and we're trying to assess how healthy our animals are, and we don't really know how to do that with corals. Like, do we look at their polyps being like out or how they're feeding? And I was like, oh, you just look at it. And I'm like, okay, but what do we look at? Yeah, exactly. The same kind of thing of like, how do we know if the coral is healthy or not? So we started working with them and trying to develop some colors for the corals that they have in captivity. And it was really great because my first undergraduate student, she got to help develop this card, go work at the aquarium, come up with a color swatch, kind of like a paint swatch, and develop that and give it to them for testing to see if they can match the colors with the corals that they had. And then we also paired that with an actual measurement, a quantitative measurement of health of corals. And now they have that tool and they love it. And they're just like, now every aquarium needs to have this. And we're like,
absolutely.
We're like, yes, we agree, but also that's a lot of work. But yes, we agree. So that was part of the initiation that we started working with them. And we've been working together, like I said, for almost 4 years now of either the color card, and now more recently we're doing more coral conservation series with them and doing more education and outreach about corals and having conversations about, hey, this is what a coral is, this is why they're important. And on top of that, hey, this is what a scientist is. Yeah. And this is what a life in a scientist looks like. And this is what we do. And just a more behind the scenes to make science more approachable and also bring corals closer to people all across the world, regardless of where they're located.
Make it more relatable, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we're just normal people. We're just not very good at talking to people. we're normal, I promise.
I think you're good at talking to people.
Well, I swear I'm normal.
Yeah, you're a normal person, very much. So while we're on the topic of collaboration, last year, you were announced as one of HRI's new fellows. And so you're working with Dr. Mark Bessanen. He's our Director of International Programs here at HRI. And you're also working with our chairs in Mexico and Cuba. Correct. So tell us a little bit about what you're going to be working on with them as an HRI fellow.
Yeah, this has been
Probably a lot.
Yeah. Well, one of my major things when I moved back to the mainland was to be able to reach out to other communities and see how I can help with the work that they're doing. And that was kind of instilled in me when I was in Hawaii is, yes, we could do science, like I mentioned earlier, but does that science mean something unless someone is able to use it to help better manage their own resources? So when I've had conversations with Mark, one of the things that keeps coming up is like, how do we help people who don't have as many resources, and how can we help support the needs that they have so they can better manage their resources that they have? So he brought me into this group looking at understanding how Cuban reefs and also reefs in Mexico are being monitored after a certain amount of time and seeing what kind of support we can provide for them. And this will involve a lot of the work that we're trying to start with is one, having conversations about what we know and what we don't know and what people are doing in those areas.
Sure. I'm sure it's completely different than what, our resource managers might be doing here.
Right. But the thing is about that is a lot of people have some really great techniques or ways that they're implementing how they look at their reefs. And we want to try, all we want to do is understand, okay, what are you doing here? What are you doing there? And how can we compare them? Yeah. Or do you need support in order, do you need more training to help you be able to count more fish or accurately assess how big the fish are or accurately assess the health of the corals and how can we support you? Yeah. So those are the conversations that we are having of bringing people together, putting them in the same room and saying, these are the problems that we are having and these are the solutions that other people have done and can we do knowledge share of that and help each other and then also find other resources to get the tools that they need to better manage their systems, the reef ecosystems. Because what we know is the Gulf is not just Texas and Louisiana.
Yeah.
The Gulf is Mexico, Cuba, it's Florida. Like, we need to work together to manage these ecosystems together. And in order to do that, we need to support each other.
For sure. And I can only imagine that whenever you get all of these people, you know, in a room together and you're sharing these ideas and having these discussions, you know, it gets you so much farther than, you know, if you were just to stay in your little box and it's like, okay, we're just going to focus on, you know, Gulf Texas and, you know, the Gulf around Florida and areas like that. So I think that that's one of the really interesting things that, you know, Mark does and you'll get to do with him is having those conversations with folks that otherwise may have never happened.
Exactly. And I've been part of this. The first conversation that we started having was with the disease outbreak, which was extremely alarming because, again, we just didn't think it was going to come to the flower gardens, but we saw what was happening in other areas. And just being able to respond to something that happens and progresses so fast and not know what to do and kind of feeling helpless in that moment. Part of the workshop that Mark brought everyone together was to really understand and share, hey, this is what we've done in these places and this is what's worked and this didn't work. And that was extremely helpful because we just don't have enough time with how fast that disease moves. And then the next workshop we started talking about like, okay, how do we quantify health across our different reef ecosystems? And now we're talking about moving forward of how do we help support methodologies that can help us standardize how we look and measure our corals and fish across these different communities.
Wow.
So just having those conversations and supporting each other is extremely important because we have resources that they don't and they have resources that we don't. So how can we help each other for this better or this greater good of preserving our reefs in the Gulf, in the Caribbean as well.
Right. And it goes back to just the overall just communication and science communication.
Right.
And, you know, it's a great lead into the narrative gem, really. So I don't want to finish the podcast without talking about this. So this is your new book that you co-authored, The Narrative Gem for Science Graduate Students and Postdocs. So talk a little bit about what the narrative gem is and how it can be beneficial to students and science communicators.
Of course. So I want to be honest about this book because the motivation behind it is a bit selfish.
Okay.
Because when I was starting my career as a scientist, I was taught and I was trained that you are a researcher and you're only a researcher.
Oh, interesting.
And someone else will do the communications for you.
Okay.
I know. And I was like, oh, okay. So when I was studying in Hawaii, we experienced a coral bleaching event and it was massive. A lot of corals died.
No.
So actually, you know, at first I was really excited because I was studying coral bleaching and this visual response of corals are not healthy and seeing a lot of corals do that across an entire reef, I was like, this is really cool. Like I can see all these corals are unhealthy and they're all responding in a similar way to this warming that's happening in our waters. And then afterwards, we went out and we collected all this data and we wrote up a publication because that's what we do as scientists. And then we published it and the corals, some of them died and recovered.
Yeah.
And then the next year it happened again. And I felt like I was doing my duty of going out and collecting data and then publishing that, and that was good enough.
And then that's kind of where it stopped, right?
Right, yeah. And I thought I was doing my part in communicating my science and helping show that, hey, this is happening, we should do something about it. And I even made recommendations of like what we should do with coral bleaching or how we should help with quantifying it or managing which reefs are being impacted. But when it happened again, I think that's, for me, where it was a pivotal moment in my life where I realized that doing research alone wasn't enough.
Sure, yeah.
And I was like, I decided if I wanted to go out there and tell people that this was a problem and help direct solutions to coral bleaching, I needed to become a better communicator with people in order to communicate the science that I was doing.
Yeah.
So I sought out to do this, and one of the first things I did is I Googled how to communicate science. And it wasn't really, there was some tricks, like know your audience and make sure you have some jokes or, make it relatable.
Sure, yeah.
But it wasn't really helpful for me because I just didn't feel like there wasn't really any structured way of how do I know which information to present and how to present that information based on the audience I was talking to. It wasn't very logical about how to do that. It was more of a piecemeal approach with that.
Gotcha.
So when I was interviewing and I started this position, they actually asked me to teach a science communication course.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're like, hey, your talk was really great. You know, they didn't really say this, but maybe they're like, hey, she speaks, you know, very well. She can teach science communication,
She can
right?
handle it, right? Just throw it at her. It'll be fine.
Like, okay, yeah, I can do that. Which I think is really funny. I tell my students too, I'm like, you know, I don't have a background in communications like you do at all. I just talk, and I guess pretty well, and now they want me to teach other people.
Right? You're obviously doing a good job.
So I, you know, that was like the reality of it. Of okay, if I really want to be effective, I can't really just string things together and become an effective science communicator if I don't really know the background or really how to do this or the structure of that. So I started working with Dr. Randy Olson, who was actually a professor as well, and he left his position as a tenured professor and went to film school.
What?
Because of the same kind of reason of we need to be better at communicating, and the best way I could learn how to communicate is to go to film school and learn about from the movies of how do you really communicate information to people.
That's really
what
amazing.
Does that story structure look like?
Yeah.
So now he's been doing this communications training and science, and I've been working with him for the past, I think it's 3 years now, and we started working together, and I've been taking his trainings of how to actually be more structured in how we communicate our science.
Wow.
And part of this is I started implementing and training our students here at A&M Corpus about how do we do this approach, how do we structure information, how do we tell a narrative, and how do we tell a story based on the information that we're sharing. And he found out, he's like, oh, that's great, like that you're doing this. And more people asked about, oh, well, how do you do this? How do you implement? How do you train people how to do this? And he's like, you know what, we should write a book.
You're like, okay.
I'm like, yeah, okay, I have a lot of things going on.
I have a lot of things to do, but sure,
I was
I'll
like,
add
okay,
it to
yeah,
my
corals
list.
and books. Okay. So we sat out. We were like, okay, we're gonna write a book. I was in the middle of field season in Hawaii, and we sat down, we wrote the book, and we pulled it together, and that's what came out of this, is really trying to implement and show other people, yes, it might seem really overwhelming, but here is a systematic way that you can approach science and any actually kind of conversations that you have and structure that information that people understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I just did a training last night after I spoke with you. I did a 2.5-hour training too for other graduate students at the university. And one of them came back to me when I did a training 6 months ago, and he is in the engineering department. And he's like, I just want to thank you so much, because when I would talk to people, I just felt like they weren't listening, or I was giving them too much information. Yeah, it was overwhelming them. And he's like, and now I feel like I'm very confident in how I communicate, and I'm able to present information that is in a way that they understand, and I'm not talking down to them.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're having a common ground conversation, and I feel more effective in what I'm trying to do. And I just really want to thank you for doing that. And that's really rewarding for me, because when we talk about communications, people are just like, yeah, you just go talk to people. But it's a lot,
not that
you
easy.
know that. Yeah. I'm preaching to the choir right now. Like, it's a lot harder, but teaching scientists like, hey, you have to get out of your little bubble. Like you're in the weeds. You have to bring it out so people understand what you're saying. And then you can take them on your journey about your research and relate to them why it matters.
For sure.
So it's been really rewarding, because all of my stuff started because I felt like I wasn't doing my job as a scientist and communicating my science.
I love that, though. I love that you were able to step back and kind of recognize that. And, you weren't just like, all right, well, this is my job. I'm going to write this paper and call it a day. But you really wanted to make sure that your message and your work was reaching the right people and reaching even farther than that, so that your work could be understood. So that's really important.
What else? There's only so much we can do, right, in our time, in our day. And that's kind of been my motivation moving forward, is what kind of person am I going to be moving forward? Am I going to be a person who, is just generating data and that data goes live somewhere? Or am I going to really try to make change? And what can I do in my own capacity to help create some of that change that I would like to see? And that's been the motivation I've had with my students too, of, hey, we all need to be better communicators. Let's work on this together, because the more we as scientists are better communicators, the more we are able to reach people and help them understand that science is really important, but there's always a disconnect, and we need help with connecting with our communities, because we want to help. We just don't know how, and a lot of it is because of communication barrier.
Sure,
and we just need to build that bridge, and the work needs to come from our side.
Yeah.
It really does.
Well, I mean, I always like to tell people, I say I'm a communications coordinator, but okay, what does that mean? So I like to say, well, I try and translate the science into more easily understood language that, somebody watching the local newscast can understand, or somebody that's reading a Facebook post can understand. And, sometimes it's not that easy.
Right.
Sometimes you have to, you don't want to talk down so much that you erase the science and or that you make your audience feel like you are like you're talking down to them, or like they can't understand something. So it's a really fine balance. But in a past life, I was a park interpreter way out in the Big Bend of Texas, and so I think I took a lot of lessons from that. I didn't interpret language, but I had to figure out a way to interpret a resource and find a way for just everyday people that were coming through the park to relate to that history, relate to those resources, or relate to that mountain, whatever it may have been.
Right.
And so I think that just those little lessons of figuring out, what is it that people want to know? What's the most important message that you can get out there, and how do we make them care?
Right.
So I think I really applaud you for, going this route and putting that out there, because it is so important. And it's like we keep saying, it's how we make people care and make people want to help. So,
and it's extremely important. And one of the biggest things I say, and it's in the book, is what we call Shirley's Law. And if you want to tell your story, you want to be the person that tells your story. You don't want somebody else to tell it for you, because they might not like the way you tell it. So that's why I'm trying to empower our students to be the person that tells their story, to tells their research. And of course, we need to have people help support that story or that research that we're doing. But the more we have people out there and talking with people about their research or talking about the science that they're doing, that's where we're really going to see the change happen.
Yeah, for sure. Next time I do a media training, I'm just going to be like, hey, Keisha, just come over and just talk to everybody, please. She can do this better than I can.
Or maybe I'll just take your lessons too.
Oh, well.
But because there's so much we can learn about just communications in general. And it's really important. And that was something that I was like, yeah, there's so many jobs that we have to do as scientists, and maybe I don't have to be a communications person.
Yeah.
But then actually bridging and helping people form those connections and understand how they're presenting, it is really important, not even for just science to public, but also within the science community as well.
With each other.
Yeah, because we're also just not very good at talking to each other.
Yeah.
And we're trying to be better at that and talking the same language instead of staying in our little bubbles.
It's real easy to just put your head down and just start working and let that be it. So
so we're working on it. Stay tuned. Maybe eventually we'll be people who we're more extroverted.
Yeah.
Maybe eventually.
Yeah, maybe eventually. I mean, I'm definitely introverted, but maybe one day I'll figure this extrovert thing out. So
let me know when you find a
Yeah, I'll let you know. All right, so today is not National Women in Science Day, but we're going to celebrate it today.
Anyway.
We're a few days late. Yes, we're going to celebrate it because you are a badass woman in science, and so I think you're worth celebrating, and it's always worth celebrating all of the contributions that women have made to science. So I would like to ask you, since you are a first-generation scientist, is there anybody, that while you were growing up that you really looked up to and that inspired you to get into science?
Oh, of course. And part of it was, just science in general I was really inspired by. But there have been a lot of females, actually a lot of my own female mentors who have been really inspirational to me. And of course, Jane Goodall was a really huge inspiration to me. And even in the field of coral reef ecology, Nancy Knowlton is a huge inspiration, and Sylvia Earle.
Oh, yeah.
And all of my mentors, my PI was a male, but all my mentors were females. And just seeing how they were able to handle being a woman and being able to be in a male-dominated field at their time and be able to push through those barriers has been so inspiring for me of hey, yeah, we can do this and we can balance multiple things. And regardless of what gender we are, we can really make a contribution to that.
Absolutely.
And even my lab, all except for two are females too.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
We were all females, and then we're okay, I guess we have to let some males in.
Yeah,
so.
You got to let the guys in too.
Lots of women power going on. And then, of course, the male supporting the women too, because it is a difficult role to play as a female sometimes, where you have to juggle multiple things. And even our personalities, we're not really built to be people who push barriers, but now we're we're learning that, hey, we do need to push barriers, and
we can.
And we can push barriers to make a difference.
Absolutely.
And I think every day should be National Women in Science Day.
I totally agree with you. It definitely should. It's something worth celebrating all the time. I can imagine that you said you were just inspired by science whenever you were a kid. I can imagine we were very similar. I was just the kid that was like, I was outside all the time because I lived in the middle of nowhere. So every little critter, every little insect, whatever it was, I was just fascinated by it and I needed to know more. And so I was this kid that had this bookshelf of like Audubon guides of God knows what, like everything I could possibly get my hands on. But yeah, I was just inspired by science too when I was a kid. And
yeah, same thing. Nature was so interesting. And I was that annoying child that was like asking all these questions.
Yes.
my family, my parents were just like, I don't know. Just stop asking questions. I'm like, why?
Stop asking questions. And then here's a book.
Yeah. And that's the funny thing. And now my whole career is asking questions.
Yeah.
So that's just really rewarding to be able to go from who you were as a child and what really interests you to like now my career is all about asking questions and encouraging other people to ask questions, which is kind of, I don't even know how to describe that. It's like full circle there.
Oh, for sure.
What was happened with my life. Because I never really understood what a career was because my family's lives haven't been careers. They've been jobs. And now having a career where I actually enjoy what I've been doing my entire life is part of what I do now.
Aww. Yeah, that's awesome.
It's really rewarding.
That's really cool. I don't know how on earth I've managed to pull together a journalism degree and a degree in natural resources and agriculture. So talk about full circle.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But somehow it's worked out, and I feel pretty fortunate to have been able to make it this far with such a interesting background. But
I know, and I think that's something that not a lot of people talk about, and I try to talk about with my students, is that we all have our own journeys to get to where we need to go. And not everyone's journey is the same, and that is okay. And it's better if it's not the same.
100%.
Because we have people who are non-traditional students who come back to school, and that's great. Come back to school and be lifelong learners. And that's something I think we should celebrate. And, regardless of your different degrees or where you've been or where you're going, it's just really great to see and support each other in those journeys that they have.
100%. I couldn't agree more. Being a lifelong learner is such an important thing, and just always maintaining that childlike curiosity and just wanting to learn and wanting to grow. I think that's so important and definitely something to be celebrated. So before we wrap up here, do you have any really memorable moments from some dives or some interesting like critters that you may have run into that you'd like to tell us about?
Oh, yes.
I'm sure you've got a ton.
I do. Well, one always comes to mind because it's such a weird experience in the fact that I had the really rare opportunity to go up to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, which is only a handful of people have been up there. And excuse me, it's a very unique ecosystem because the reefs there and the whole ecosystem itself is relatively still intact. So there are a lot of sharks there.
Okay.
And part of my responsibilities when I was going up there wasn't actually for a coral position, like a coral reef biologist. So I wasn't going up there as that. I was actually going up as a shark biologist.
Oh.
Yeah,
okay.
I don't know if you don't know this. I don't study things that move very well. But I was part of the shark team going up, and I was just really excited to be able to be given an opportunity to go see these relatively pristine areas and a just beautiful ecosystem, and it was life-changing. And part of that journey was I actually did end up switching the corals. Part of it was I was going to help out with the shark team, but then the coral team needed me, and I was like, sorry, I got to go to the coral team. Sorry, corals.
Double duty.
When I was on my first dive on the coral team with one of my really good friends, we were doing some disease surveys. There was no disease, but just in case. And we were doing our safety stop. And there was a little bit of a current, so we're just doing a little drift dive, which is really fun because you get to see a lot of things in a short period of time. And we are right off of Kuri Atoll, which is the most northern atoll that there is on the northwestern Hawaii Islands. And I just look around, and all of a sudden I start seeing some shadows. And I see more shadows. And what happens is I'm looking around, and I see my dive partner, and my eyes are starting to get big, and he's pointing around me.
Like a heart's pounding.
Yeah. And what happened is we were engulfed with a school of sharks. And
oh my gosh.
it was one of those experiences where you recognize in that moment, like you have anxiety and you're like, oh my gosh, there's sharks. Oh my gosh, I'm in the ocean and there's sharks, of course, right?
Of course.
But being surrounded by that many sharks, I think we estimated about 80 sharks were surrounding us. And
that's incredible.
We just, my heart was pounding and I just like stopped and took a really deep breath and I was like, wait a second, this isn't scary.
This is amazing.
This is amazing. Yeah. And it's just like that mindset of, I am experiencing what a healthy reef ecosystem looks like.
Absolutely.
And we got some really cool footage of it. And we also said that this is the real Sharknado versus that fake film that they had of like the sharks coming out of the tornado.
Absolutely.
But it was one of those moments where I don't think a lot of people have had that experience. And I was really fortunate that I experienced it, even though I was no longer on the shark team. And we came up and we saw the shark team and we're like, oh my gosh, we saw like all these sharks. And they're just like
we didn't.
Like,
we missed it.
Aren't you guys supposed to be looking at corals?
Like, yes, but
and that was the thing. Like people ask me, like, aren't you scared of sharks? I'm like, no. I'd like there's other things that I'm more nervous about.
And you're
in the
going
ocean.
in their habitat.
Right. It's their habitat. It's their
Yeah.
home, and just being able to be in the presence of animals that don't know what you are because they don't recognize humans. They're not around humans up in those remote places, and be able to experience what they experience. It was so beautiful and so calming at the same time.
Yeah.
And I feel just very fortunate. I think that moment I will always carry with me of being able to see a more natural or pristine ecosystem.
I love that so much.
Yeah.
I love it.
It
I
was
would
a
love to
beautiful
see footage
experience.
from that. Yeah.
It's a very granular because it was like from like 10 years ago when
the
our footage
GoPros
was
probably weren't as great. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it was one of those things where I think, I don't know, I always share that with my students of there are opportunities in which you will appreciate that we have these beautiful ecosystems. And I don't think there's enough time in a day where we can truly appreciate how amazing they are.
For sure. You're going to remember that for the rest of your life and get to
Yeah,
tell
exactly.
that story for the rest of your
I
life.
know.
So.
It's amazing.
Awesome. So yesterday when we talked, you had talked about some really exciting things that you guys have are going to have coming up in your lab.
Mhm.
So live corals?
Live corals,
Yeah.
yes.
So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we're excited. Oh, I'm excited, but I'm also a bit nervous.
Okay.
So
That's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Because corals are complicated.
Yeah.
They're very complicated. They're very sensitive. So it is challenging to keep them in captivity, but we're going to try to do that. Part of the goals are to understand more about our species in the Caribbean and in the Gulf, of how healthy they are and how they might be responding to some changes that are occurring. One of the things we're going to be investigating is how sediment might influence corals. And if we do have any dredging activities that occur or removal of any sediment for ship channels, how detrimental is that to corals? Because we really don't know for Caribbean species, where we assume it's this amount, but we really don't know if that is the true amount or if they're more sensitive to that.
Wow.
So we're gonna do that. We're gonna try.
I'm going to try.
It's gonna be successful. It's keeping corals is just like having a baby, and they need constant attention. And what I'm really excited about, though, is for students on campus and other people to actually see corals alive.
Yes,
Instead
for
of
sure.
seeing skeletons or photos of corals, we'll actually have them inside of aquaria where they can come see them,
Wow.
which I'm really, really excited about.
That's awesome. Well, I think that our team is probably going to have to come over
Okay.
and check it out. So we'll come
Perfect.
invade your lab one day. but
Perfect.
Awesome. Well, Keisha, thank you so much for coming and being on the Gulf Stream today. This was such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for
and,
having me.
I'm really excited to see what's going on next in your lab.
Yeah,
So,
a whole bunch to
yeah.
come. Lots of work, but it's going to be really exciting.
awesome. Well, thanks, Keisha.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Gulf Stream. If you enjoyed this episode, you can help make a difference in the Gulf by contributing to the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies research and efforts to create healthier coastal and marine ecosystems. Visit hartresearch.org. That's HARTE research.org for more information. Please note, the views and opinions expressed by guests of the Gulf Stream do not necessarily reflect the views of the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies or Texas A&M University-Corpus Christi. It is our mission to be an honest broker, providing only science-based solutions to Gulf of Mexico problems and other environmental issues. This podcast is intended to provide our guests with a safe and open forum for them to express themselves freely.